So I've pretty much given on the Picard show, but we have more information, interviews with Picard and Patrick Stewart, and why it's imperative that Star Trek address current events and modern politics. This is not unheard of in Star Trek to deal with political issues or social issues or cultural issues. These are great. This is no problem. The problem is how on the nose and how current does it have to be? The wonderful thing about Star Trek or science fiction or the genre as a whole is you get to tell stories you wouldn't normally tell in contemporary fiction. You don't want to combine those two too often. The only reason I could think of to combine contemporary fiction and fantasy or science fiction is to allow the audience to identify with a common problem or conflict that they wouldn't, let's say, I have problems riding my dragon, or I'm trying to fix the flux capacitor. Like there's problems outside of science fiction that people might be more closer to. So combining that in a more mundane sense would work in the story's favor and the audience's favor to understand these characters a bit more. That's generally why you want to have contemporary in fantasy or contemporary in science fiction. To use it for the sake of telling a political message is kind of pointless. You're wasting the opportunity, you're wasting the lore. And we've seen what happened with Picard, how the lore and the characters are now completely different. And this is a waste of everyone's time. It's no longer Star Trek. It's Star Trek Picard, the soapbox, or the political grandstanding, or whatever you want to call it. I'm not sure what it is anymore, and frankly, I don't really care. But it's interesting to see where Picard, or rather Patrick Stewart's mind is, because we're no longer thinking of Picard as Picard. It's Patrick Stewart. He's saying what he wants to do. So this was an interview with Will Wheaton, which I'm not going to play. I'll just talk about the things they mentioned. I always believed it was easier to bring this into the work back in the time of Next Generation, that what Next Generation was offering was hope. There will be a future and it will be better. There is that still, I think, in the Star Trek world. So yes, this is Gene Roddenberry's view of the future. We've gone past the need for resources. We've gone past the need for war. We're now in this betterment society where we wish to seek new life and understand it and see how that relates to humanity. That's kind of what science fiction is all about. In the idealized futuristic world, rather, of humanity. That's what science fiction is about. He continued, but what we're having to do now is to reflect gently, subtly, not with a sledgehammer, the world that we are presently living in. Star Trek always did that. In some capacity, yes, it did do that. It raised questions about what does it mean to be alive? Does it make you a slave? Are you part of a cog in a machine? All sorts of wonderful questions that you wouldn't normally be able to question or talk about in contemporary fiction, unless it would be sort of contemplative or fantastical fiction, like something like 1984, in an alternate world. Particularly in the last four or five seasons of The Next Generation, we did that. I would say every episode is pretty much like that. It's science fiction. You're always sort of questioning what this is all about by looking at aliens and having them represent certain societies, whether it's today or 200 years ago. That's kind of the motif. You do that with science fiction, especially in Star Trek, where it's like, oh, another political message. Oh, okay, another social message. Great, that's fine. Good stuff. With metaphor, we can compare the world of Star Trek to the present-day world, and we need to be doing that in this world because we are in some trouble. I'm like, wait a second. Wait, why are we using Star Trek to help us out of a problem? What exactly is the problem here? It is the only people who can get us out of trouble. So somehow Star Trek is going to be getting you out of trouble. Political, social trouble, whatever that even means. I'm not sure how, if at all, ever, Star Trek did that. It opens up some questions. It makes us address social commentary, dramatic issues for sure. How far are you willing to go? We've seen a lot of wonderful episodes in Deep Space Nine. How far was Sisko willing to go to get what he needed to do to prevent a war? How many people does he need to kill? What calculus do you have to perform to keep people safe and alive? That's kind of what war is like. And the Federation is pretty much a warlike entity, or a militaristic one, rather. But they're usually at their best when they're fighting, when they're in conflict against the Borg, against aliens that are stronger than them, the Dominion, the Jem'Hadar, etc. I have little confidence in our politicians. Here we go. I'm talking about the UK as well as about the USA. All right, so which politicians? Be more specific. You can't just say Trump all day. It is people who are going to improve how we live, where we live, and the safety in which we live. And for this part, I would mostly agree. When you're talking about technology or business, those are the driving forces that change society. Providing new services, providing new products, new ways of living, new ways of communicating, new ways to conduct business. That's great. Unless, of course, we're talking about wars or politicians ending wars or starting wars, and that would have a much greater impact than just technology. That would be life-changing. So World War II, various wars in Vietnam, all sorts of nasty things happening in the world where you're bombing a city or something like that. So we're talking about progress or extreme violence in either case. We've seen that recently with controversy over police violence and so forth. So here we're talking about the whole Black Lives Matter movement, or rather the effect of no longer giving money or as much money to the police force, and how that's going to work out. We still don't know. I'd love to see more examples. I haven't seen too many recent ones of the police force being defunded or using that money in alternate ways as a betterment to the community. I don't know any community that would not want a police force. So the issue is always, how can we more efficiently use our funds to help the community as opposed to just giving it all to the police? That's the general attitude. Whether that's something else or a spurn something else is another story, like rioting and looting and destruction of property. So I don't think Star Trek is going to help that. I really don't think. That's a little too on the nose. Like, what are you going to have? Some sort of police state story in some futuristic world where authoritarianism is rampant? There's curfews. There's all sorts of nasty things happen. Like, what kind of story? We've seen those stories. They're there. We've seen that in hell. The first season of Deep Space Nine had that. That was, I think, also mentioned in the first episode of The Next Generation with Q. So we have had dark paths in Star Trek's future history, where humanity has had a third world war, a eugenics war, etc. So we've had this before. The stories are there. Unless you want to retell the story in a different light, that's fine. But it's harder in Star Trek Picard because our world is much more uncomfortable than it was at the time of Next Generation. Yeah, why is that? How did that happen? There's no explanation why the world is suddenly more uncomfortable. Why resources are now a thing again. Why people are not behaving properly. Why Starfleet admirals and those in charge are swearing and being cruel and weird. Starfleet and the Federation, one could rely on 100%. They were there. They were rock solid. And now they aren't because story. There's no reason. There's no build-up. There's no setup. It's just, oh, now they're bad. Now they're corrupt. Now they're swearing. Why? What happened? Why did this happen? How did this happen? Stewart continued. Not so solid now, it would seem. There have been shifts in all that, as there have been shifts in our lives. So I don't know how this relates to contemporary reality. How, because Picard, or rather because Patrick Stewart wasn't happy with the UK or American politicians, therefore there has to be shifts in the continuity and lore of Gene Roddenberry's future world. I don't get it. Okay. I hope we can find ways that are not too heavy-handed, good luck, whereby we can underline the fact that it is people themselves who can make the difference. I don't see how that's a message specific to Star Trek. When you're talking about stories, you're talking about a protagonist doing something. They are the hero of their story. They are usually a paragon. They strive for something. They strive for an ideal. They could be an anti-hero too. They could be striving for control. They could be striving to dominate others, to kill others. So it's always the individual. You never see a story, usually, as the group solving problems. It's always the hero, the person on the front line, the general at the back, causing the change. And there's some ideological spirit with that. There's some theme, usually, as to how they go about doing what they're doing, how they deal with such conflict. So I don't know how the people themselves, unless he's talking about some sort of revolution, there's a status quo, and there's individuals, and they rise up and stop. Like, what's going to happen? There's going to be a bunch of people against the Federation, going to say, hey, the Federation's corrupt. We should get rid of who's ever in charge of security or whatever. Yeah, she's a spy. It's like, we know that already. That was resolved at the end of the first season of Picard. So what is he getting into? We're not sure here. The interview is answering a question that we could provide any information on season 2. I've had some encouraging news only yesterday about when we might be looking at starting again. It's all these predictions are dependent on the best possible circumstance. I don't know what that means. I can tell you that CBS is utterly committed to another season of our show. Utterly committed. That's going to happen. Well, fantastic. We can't wait to see another destruction of lore and retelling of Gene Roddenberry's vision in a darker, twistier light. It's just, why keep prolonging the inevitable? Just crush it all, first episode, and do your own thing. Make it whatever you want, because it's already a mess. Other than that, I'm not being provocative, but I don't actually have much to tell you. Okay, great. So fantastic. Thanks, Patrick Stewart. I can't wait to have a more political message in Picard because of the sheer mess that was the original first season, which bored me and made me question why I'm even watching this thing. But hey, maybe Star Trek could get better. I don't know how, but maybe a darker Gene Roddenberry's view of the future is exactly what Star Trek needed. It would just be the exact opposite of what it was supposed to be. What a great idea. Thanks, Patrick Stewart. Hope everyone had fun listening. Have yourself a great day.